On the 17th of November 1942, as American forces secured their foothold on Guadalcanal's blood-soaked beaches, Lieutenant Hiroshi Takeda was led, hands bound, uniform torn, into a gray interrogation room at a U.S. naval intelligence facility in the South Pacific. The chair scraped concrete as he sat. The American colonel across from him said nothing at first, only studied the Japanese officer with the patience of a man holding all the cards. Takeda's jaw was set, his posture defiant. He had surrendered his body, but not his faith. The early months of the war had given men like Takeda everything to believe in. Tokyo had told them they were invincible. The victories came so fast they blurred together. Pearl Harbor, Singapore, the Philippines, the Dutch East Indies. Japan's empire stretched across the Pacific like a rising sun. And every soldier knew it. The Americans were soft, their will broken, their fleet shattered. Even now, in this concrete cell thousands of miles from home, Takeda clung to that certainty. But within the intelligence divisions of both nations, a quiet disagreement had been brewing. Some American officers believed Japan was too entrenched, too fanatical to be psychologically shaken. They advocated for island-by-island annihilation, total war until unconditional surrender. Others, represented by officers like Colonel James Harrington, understood something more subtle. Wars are won in the mind before they're won on the battlefield. Show a man the impossible made real, and you don't just defeat his army, you shatter the story he tells himself. Harrington was one of the officers who had quietly opposed the Doolittle Raid when it was first proposed. Too risky, he'd argued. Too many variables. 16 B-25 bombers launched from an aircraft carrier 1,000 miles from Tokyo? It was tactically insane. Friends in naval intelligence had warned him that if the mission failed, the humiliation would be catastrophic. Not just for Doolittle, but for the entire American war effort. Even now, 6 months after the raid's success, Harrington remembered the night before the bombers launched. Captain Mark Mitcher had confided over coffee. "If this works, it changes everything. If it doesn't, we've just proven Japan right about us." Before we continue, click that subscribe button, like this video, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. It brings me great joy, knowing that these war stories and lessons get to people all over the world. Your support helps us bring more thrilling war stories, and trust me, you won't want to miss them. Now, let's get back to the story. But the mission hadn't failed. And 3 months before Takeda's capture, Harrington had sat in a classified briefing where reconnaissance photos from Tokyo were spread across a mahogany table. The raid had done minimal physical damage, someone noted. A few factories, some residential blocks. "That's not the point," Harrington had said quietly. "The point is, we touched them. We proved they're not untouchable." He'd studied those photos for hours, knowing they represented something far more valuable than bomb tonnage. They were proof that Japan's invincibility was a lie. And lies, once exposed, can't be unlearned. At first, the Americans had everything going for them in the propaganda war. After Pearl Harbor, the recruitment offices overflowed. Factory production soared. The sleeping giant had awakened, as Yamamoto had feared. But by mid-1942, the public was restless, demanding visible victories. The Doolittle Raid, though operationally small, gave them that. Headlines screamed, "Tokyo bombed!" Newsreels showed Doolittle's crews as heroes. What Americans didn't fully grasp yet was the raid's psychological impact on the other side of the Pacific. Now, 6 months later, Harrington sat across from a man who embodied that impact. Takeda had fought at Midway. He'd witnessed the loss of 4 carriers, Japan's invincible fleet reduced to burning wreckage in a single day. He'd watched the tide turn at Guadalcanal, where American forces landed not as desperate defenders, but as conquerors. Yet still, the lieutenant held on to his defiance like a shield. The American victories at Midway and Guadalcanal had been crucial, yes, but they hadn't broken Japanese morale entirely. The soldiers still fought with suicidal devotion. The pilots still dove their planes into American ships. What was needed wasn't just military defeat, but a psychological awakening. Harrington believed the Doolittle photos could provide that. Not through intimidation, but through revelation. The colonel opened a manila folder. Inside were photographs, black and white, grainy, undeniable. He slid the first one across the table without a word. Takeda's eyes dropped to the image. His expression didn't change immediately. Then his breath caught. Tokyo, the Imperial Palace District. Smoke rising from rooftops. Civilians scattered in the streets. Faces turned skyward in terror. B-25 bombers, Harrington said quietly. Launched from the USS Hornet. April 18, 1942. 16 aircraft. 80 men. They flew 900 miles across the Pacific, dropped their payloads over Tokyo, and kept flying until they ran out of fuel over China. Takeda's fingers trembled as he touched the photograph. "Impossible," he whispered. Harrington slid another photo across, then another. The Imperial Hotel, the Yokosuka Naval Arsenal, a burning factory in Kawasaki, each image a crack in the foundation of everything Takeda had been taught. It wasn't about the damage, Harrington continued. It was about the message, that nowhere is safe, that the Americans you thought were defeated, they were only getting started. The lieutenant's eyes glistened, not with tears of sorrow, but with something more complex, the terrible recognition of truth. He'd believed Japan untouchable. He'd believed America broken. And now, staring at photographic evidence of B-25s over Tokyo, launched from a carrier across impossible distances, he understood what Yamamoto had understood months earlier. This wasn't a war Japan could win. It was a war that would only escalate. The Americans had only just begun. But Lieutenant Takeda hadn't always known doubt. To understand the magnitude of what these photographs meant to him, why they shattered not just his confidence, but his entire conception of the war, we must travel back to December 1941, to the moment when a young officer named Hiroshi Takeda stood on the deck of a Japanese carrier and watched the first wave of Zeros take flight toward Pearl Harbor. Back then, victory seemed not just possible, but inevitable. Back then, Japan's empire was rising, and nothing, not even the vast Pacific Ocean, could stand in its way. 6 months earlier, Lieutenant Hiroshi Takeda had stood on the deck of the carrier Shokaku and watched the morning sun break over the Philippine Sea. Victory tasted like salt air and engine oil. It felt like destiny. December 1941 had been a month of miracles. Pearl Harbor had crippled the American Pacific Fleet in a single morning. Battleships capsized, thousands dead. The pride of the U.S. Navy burning in Hawaiian waters. Takeda had listened to the radio broadcasts with his fellow officers, their faces flushed with sake and triumph. The Emperor's voice seemed to carry divine authority when he spoke of Japan's sacred mission. Admiral Yamamoto, the architect of their impossible victory, became more than a military leader. He became myth. "The Americans never saw us coming," Lieutenant Nakamura had said that night, raising his cup. "They thought we were too small, too weak. Now they know better." Takeda had believed every word. Why wouldn't he? The proof arrived daily in dispatches that read like fever dreams. Hong Kong fell on Christmas Day. Manila surrendered on January 2nd. The British fortress at Singapore, supposedly impregnable, collapsed on February 15th with 80,000 troops taken prisoner. The Dutch East Indies, with all their oil and rubber, became Japanese territory by March. Everywhere the rising sun advanced, the Western powers retreated. British, American, Dutch, it didn't matter. They all broke the same way, quickly, desperately, without the stomach for real war. The propaganda posters showed it clearly. pale-faced Europeans fleeing before disciplined Japanese soldiers. The newsreels confirmed it. Even the letters from home reflected it. Takeda's mother had written, in February, her calligraphy trembling with pride. They say the war will be over by summer. They say America is suing for peace. Takeda had wanted to believe that too. Part of him did. But he remembered something his commander had said during the Philippine campaign, standing amid the ruins of an American airfield. Victory is easy when your enemy isn't ready. The test comes when they are. Still, doubt seemed like treason in those early months. Japan controlled an empire stretching from Burma to the Gilbert Islands, from the Aleutians to the Dutch East Indies. More territory than Rome at its height, more ocean than any navy had ever commanded. Officers spoke openly of invading Australia, of cutting the American lifeline across the Pacific, of forcing Roosevelt to the negotiating table within a year. Takeda's faith wasn't blind, it was earned. He'd seen American positions collapse at Bataan. He'd watched British pilots retreat from superior Zeros. He'd witnessed the speed and precision of Japanese combined operations, the way Army and Navy moved like extensions of a single will. By April 1942, Lieutenant Takeda believed three things with absolute certainty: that Japan's military was invincible, that the Americans lacked the resolve for prolonged war, and that Tokyo itself, the sacred heart of the empire, would never, could never, be touched by enemy hands. He would continue believing all three things until the moment Colonel Harrington placed those photographs on the table. Until the moment he learned that April 18th had changed everything. April 18th, 1942, 8:20 a.m., on the deck of the USS Hornet, 650 miles east of Japan, 16 B-25 Mitchell bombers sat lined wing to wing, their propellers already spinning. The carrier pitched in heavy seas. Salt spray soaked the flight deck. Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle climbed into the lead aircraft, his crew silent behind him. They weren't supposed to launch yet, not for another 12 hours, not until they were closer. But a Japanese picket boat had spotted the task force at dawn. The element of surprise was bleeding away with every passing minute. Admiral Halsey had made the call: launch now or abort entirely. Doolittle's bomber had 467 feet of deck. The B-25 needed 500 to take off safely under normal conditions. But these weren't normal conditions. The Hornet turned into the wind. The deck officer dropped his flag. Doolittle released the brakes. The bomber lurched forward, engines screaming, the deck disappearing beneath him in seconds. The nose dipped toward the waves, then caught air. Climbed. Held. One by one, all 16 bombers clawed their way into the gray Pacific sky. They flew in loose formation just 50 feet above the water, low enough to avoid radar, high enough to clear the swells. For 5 hours, they saw nothing but ocean. Then the Japanese coastline emerged from the haze like a watercolor painting. Green hills, fishing villages, the suburbs of Tokyo stretching toward the bay. No fighters rose to meet them. No anti-aircraft fire erupted. The city sprawled beneath them, vast and undefended, because the idea of American bombers over Tokyo was simply impossible. Doolittle's bombardier called out the Imperial Palace District, the Yokosuka Naval Arsenal, factories in Kawasaki. One by one, the bombs tumbled free. Then the B-25s banked hard west, engines roaring, disappearing toward the China coast before Japanese fighters could even scramble. Behind them, Tokyo burned. Lieutenant Takeda first heard the news 2 days later, aboard a transport bound for New Guinea. A junior officer burst into the wardroom, face pale, voice shaking. "The homeland has been attacked. American bombers struck Tokyo." Silence crashed over the room like a wave. "Impossible," someone said. "Propaganda," another officer snapped. "American lies to boost morale." But the radio broadcasts confirmed it. Tokyo had been bombed. Civilians had died. The emperor himself had been endangered. The sacred homeland, untouchable since the Mongol invasions 7 centuries ago, had been violated by foreign aircraft. Takeda listened to the official statement, his hands gripping the edge of the table. The announcer's voice was carefully controlled, but underneath the composure lay something unfamiliar: fear. The cowardly enemy attacked our capital with a small number of aircraft. Damage was minimal. The perpetrators will face divine retribution. Minimal damage. That's what they said. Minimal. But if the damage was so minimal, why did the announcer's voice tremble? Why had they delayed the broadcast for 48 hours? Why were officers looking at each other with questions they didn't dare speak aloud? Takeda stared at the radio speaker, his certainty fracturing. "It changes nothing," he said finally, to the room, to himself. A desperate act by a dying enemy, tactically meaningless. But in the silence that followed, nobody met his eyes. And somewhere deep in his chest, beneath the layers of training and faith and pride, a whisper began, "If they could reach Tokyo, what else have we been wrong about?" Colonel Harrington spread 6 more photographs across the interrogation table like a card dealer revealing a winning hand. Each one showed a different angle of Tokyo. Smoke columns rising, crowds fleeing, buildings cratered. Takeda stared at them, his jaw working silently. "Propaganda," he said finally. "Doctored images." "No." Harrington's voice remained calm. "These were taken by Japanese photographers. Your own government's documentation of the raid. We acquired them from, sources." Takeda's eyes snapped up. "Then you admit your bombers caused minimal damage. A pinprick. Meaningless. Militarily? Sure." Harrington leaned back in his chair. "But that wasn't the point, was it? The point was proving it could be done." He slid a typed mission report across the table. Takeda's English was good enough to catch key phrases. USS Hornet. 16 B-25. Mitchell bombers. 650 nautical miles. No return plan. "No return plan," Takeda repeated slowly. His fingers touched the words as if they might burn him. "They were volunteers," Harrington said. 80 men who knew they probably wouldn't make it back. The B-25 doesn't have the range to return to the carrier. So they bombed Tokyo and kept flying west to China, hoping to crash land in friendly territory. 3 men died. 8 were captured. I believe your forces executed 3 of them. Takeda's throat tightened. Volunteers. No return plan. Men who flew into certain death just to deliver a message. Why? The word escaped before he could stop it. Because someone had to prove it could be done. Harrington's eyes held steady. Because after Pearl Harbor, America needed to hit back. Not for tactical reasons, but psychological ones. Because your Admiral Yamamoto understood something most of your high command didn't. Yamamoto? Takeda's voice sharpened with defensive pride. The architect of our greatest victory? The same man who studied at Harvard, who served as naval attaché in Washington, who knew Americans better than any officer in your fleet. Harrington paused. The same man who warned your leaders that attacking Pearl Harbor would awaken a sleeping giant. 3,000 miles away, in October 1942, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto stood on the bridge of the battleship Yamato, staring at casualty reports from Guadalcanal. His chief of staff, Matome Ugaki, stood beside him in silence. 4 carriers lost at Midway. The initiative surrendered. American forces now landing on Japanese-held territory, not defending their own. And everywhere, in every briefing, the same question hanging unspoken. How did we lose control so quickly? The Doolittle Raid, Yamamoto said quietly, almost to himself. That was the turning point. Ugaki frowned. Sir, the raid caused negligible damage. The raid proved we could be touched. Yamamoto's voice carried the weight of prophecy fulfilled. It shattered the illusion of invincibility. After that, everything changed. Midway wasn't caution, it was panic. We overextended trying to prevent another raid, and it cost us the war. He'd said it before Pearl Harbor to anyone who would listen. He'd said it after the attack, in private moments with confidants. I fear all we have done is awaken a sleeping giant and fill him with a terrible resolve. Now, 10 months into the war, the giant was fully awake. Back in the interrogation room, Takeda studied the mission report, his military mind reconstructing the operation despite himself. The audacity of it, the precision, the willingness to sacrifice everything for a symbolic victory. "Your Admiral Yamamoto," he said slowly, "gave us 6 months. He said Japan would be invincible for 6 months. And after that, Harrington finished, you'd be fighting a different war, against a different enemy than you imagined." Takeda looked at the photographs again. Not with denial this time, but with something closer to understanding. And beneath it, growing like a shadow, respect. Harrington pulled out a different folder, this one thicker, stamped with red classifications. He opened it slowly, giving Takeda time to see the header. Battle of Midway, June 4–7, 1942, Intelligence Summary. "You were still in the South Pacific when this happened," Harrington said, "so your command probably didn't tell you everything." Takeda's expression hardened. Midway was a tactical setback. We lost carriers, yes, but 4 carriers. Harrington's interruption was surgical. Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, the entire Kido Butai, your first carrier striking force, obliterated in a single day. He laid down reconnaissance photographs, carriers burning, listing, sinking. American dive bombers frozen mid-descent, the ocean churning with debris and oil slicks that stretched for miles. Takeda's hands began to tremble. "The Akagi was Yamamoto's flagship at Pearl Harbor," Harrington continued, his voice devoid of triumph, stating only facts. "The Kaga carried 70 aircraft. The Soryu and Hiryu were your newest fleet carriers. Between them, they represented half of Japan's large carrier strength. More than that, they carried your most experienced pilots, your best crews, your institutional knowledge of carrier warfare." "We still have carriers," Takeda said, but the conviction had drained from his voice. "The Shokaku, the Zuikaku, damaged at Coral Sea, under repair." Harrington slid across another document, translated Japanese radio intercepts. "Your own naval command assessed that replacing the carriers would take 2 years. Replacing the pilots? Maybe never. You lost 110 of your best aviators at Midway. Men who'd trained for a decade. Men who bombed Pearl Harbor and Darwin and Ceylon?" Takeda stared at the intercepts. His eyes moved across the characters, names of pilots he'd known, ships he'd served near, admirals who'd seemed untouchable. All of it reduced to casualty lists and damage assessments. "Why did you lose?" Harrington asked quietly. Takeda's voice caught. "The Americans were supposed to be at Pearl Harbor, not Midway. Intelligence said. Intelligence was wrong. We'd broken your naval codes weeks earlier. We knew you were coming. We knew your targets. We knew your fleet at disposition." Harrington leaned forward. "And even then, it was close. If our dive bombers had arrived 5 minutes later, if your carriers had gotten their aircraft launched, history might be different." He paused, letting that sink in. "But here's what matters. Lieutenant, Midway happened 6 weeks after Doolittle bombed Tokyo. 6 weeks after your high command realized the homeland was vulnerable. Yamamoto didn't want to attack Midway. He wanted to invade Ceylon, or Port Moresby, or consolidate gains. But after April 18th, your leaders panicked. They became obsessed with preventing another raid. So they overextended, pushed too far, too fast, and walked into a trap." Takeda closed his eyes. In his mind, he saw the Doolittle bombers over Tokyo again, not as propaganda, not as lies, but as the first domino. The raid that changed everything. The pinprick that had caused an empire to flinch, to overreact, to shatter its own invincible fleet in a desperate attempt to prevent something that had already happened. When he opened his eyes, they glistened with understanding. So, his voice was barely a whisper. They were only beginning. Harrington nodded slowly. Yes, and we still are. August 7th, 1942. Guadalcanal. Lieutenant Takeda had been part of the garrison reinforcement sent to hold the island's airfield, a strategic position the Americans called Henderson Field. The Japanese called it a temporary setback, a minor outpost that would be reclaimed within weeks. Instead, it became a graveyard. The American landing caught them off guard, not tactically, but psychologically. These weren't the desperate defenders of Wake Island or the retreating forces of Bataan. These were Marines landing with overwhelming air support, naval bombardment, and a grim determination that seemed to say, "We're not asking permission anymore." Takeda had watched the sky fill with American aircraft, Wildcats, dauntless dive bombers, even the new Corsairs. They flew in formation so thick they blotted out the sun. Japanese Zeros rose to meet them and were systematically hunted down. The same skies where Takeda had once felt invincible now belonged entirely to the enemy. The fighting devolved into brutal jungle warfare. No grand naval battles, no decisive carrier strikes, just grinding, exhausting attrition in the mud and rain. Supplies stopped coming. Reinforcements arrived piecemeal and died wholesale. Disease killed as many men as bullets. In his final days of freedom, before capture, Takeda had crouched in a destroyed bunker and listened to American artillery pound Japanese positions with mechanical precision. Endless, tireless, overwhelming. The sound reminded him of something, a distant memory he couldn't quite place. Then it came to him, factory machinery. The Americans fought like factories, like production lines, like a nation that could lose 1,000 men and replace them with 10,000 more. Now, in the POW camp, Takeda sat on a wooden bench in the compound yard, watching American transport planes land and take off with rhythmic efficiency. C-47s mostly, supplies coming in, wounded going out, replacements arriving in batches. The logistics alone would have staggered the Japanese military at its peak. Other prisoners shuffled past, hollow-eyed men who'd survived Guadalcanal's hell. Some still muttered prayers to the emperor. Others just stared at nothing. Takeda recognized that look. It was the expression of men whose certainty had been stripped away, leaving only the raw survival instinct beneath. Colonel Harrington's words echoed in his mind. They were only beginning. He understood now. The Doolittle Raid wasn't a military operation. It was a declaration. Not of victory, but of intent. It said, "We can reach you anywhere. We will keep coming. And we will never stop." Midway had been the proof. Guadalcanal was the execution. And beyond Guadalcanal? Takeda had heard whispers from guards, from interrogators, from newspapers left carelessly in common areas. The Americans were already planning the next assault, and the one after that, island by island, mile by mile, pushing inexorably toward Japan itself. He thought about his mother's letter from February. They say the war will be over by summer. It was November now. Summer had come and gone. The war wasn't over. It had barely started. A formation of American fighters roared overhead, 12 aircraft in perfect formation, their engines thundering like gods of war. Takeda watched them disappear toward the horizon, toward Japanese-held territory, and felt something crack inside his chest. Not his courage, not his loyalty, his certainty. The sky he'd once ruled now belonged to someone else. The ocean his carriers had dominated was now an American highway. The empire that had stretched from Burma to the Gilbert Islands was already contracting, already bleeding from 1,000 cuts. He thought of the B-25s over Tokyo, those 80 volunteers with no return plan, and finally understood what they'd really accomplished. They'd shown Japan its future. 3 days after the interrogation, Colonel Harrington returned to the POW compound. He carried no folders this time, no photographs of burning cities or sunken carriers. Just a single image, creased at the edges, printed in a magazine. He found Takeda sitting alone near the perimeter fence, watching the horizon. "I thought you should see this," Harrington said, offering the page. Takeda took it carefully. The photograph showed 16 men standing in front of a B-25 bomber, somewhere in America before the raid. They wore leather flight jackets and loose grins. Some had their arms around each other's shoulders. One was lighting a cigarette. Another was laughing at something off camera. They looked impossibly young. Mortal. Human. "Doolittle's crew," Harrington said quietly. "Taken the day before they shipped out. Most of them made it back. 3 didn't. 8 were captured. You know what happened to them." Takeda studied each face. No samurai stoicism. No divine invincibility. Just ordinary men who'd volunteered for a suicide mission because someone needed to prove it could be done. "They weren't supermen," Harrington continued, his voice softer now, almost reflective. "They were scared. Some of them wrote letters home they didn't expect anyone to read. Doolittle himself thought the whole thing was insane. He figured he'd be court-martialed if he survived." Takeda's thumb traced the edge of the photograph. "But they went anyway," Harrington said. "Not because they were invincible, but because they weren't. Because they understood that wars aren't won by divine destiny or superior will. They're won by ordinary people doing impossible things, over and over, until the impossible becomes inevitable." Takeda thought about the men he'd served with, officers who'd believed Japan's expansion was divinely ordained, that Yamamoto's genius made them untouchable, that the emperor's will guaranteed victory. He thought about his own certainty, his own pride, the way he'd dismissed American resolve as weakness. He thought about Pearl Harbor, the perfect strike that was supposed to end the war before it started. Instead, it had awakened something darker, something relentless. "Admiral Yamamoto knew," Takeda said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "He warned us. He said we'd awakened a sleeping giant. But we didn't listen. We thought 6 months of victories meant we'd already won." Harrington nodded. Yamamoto understood. But understanding doesn't stop a war once it starts. Takeda looked at the photograph again, at those 16 smiling men who'd flown into the heart of the Japanese Empire with no guarantee of survival. At the mechanics and bombardiers and navigators who'd become the sword that cut through Japan's illusion of safety. The Doolittle Raid hadn't destroyed factories or killed thousands. It had done something far more devastating. It had proven that Japan could bleed. And once an empire knows it can bleed, it starts to fear. And fear makes mistakes. And mistakes compound into Midway, into Guadalcanal, into the slow, grinding retreat that would define the rest of the war. Takeda closed his eyes and saw it all. The trajectory from Pearl Harbor to this moment. The inevitable arc that Yamamoto had predicted and the High Command had ignored. The Americans hadn't just begun fighting at Pearl Harbor. They'd begun learning. And every battle, every loss, every death had taught them something new. Japan had won the first 6 months. America would win everything after. Takeda carefully folded the photograph and handed it back to Harrington. Then slowly, with the formal precision of a samurai acknowledging a superior opponent, he bowed his head. "The Americans," he murmured, more to himself than to Harrington, more to history than to the present moment, "have only just begun." In April 1942, 80 American volunteers proved that nowhere was untouchable. By 1945, that lesson would be written in fire across the Japanese homeland. The Doolittle Raid changed the war, not through destruction, but through revelation. And once revealed, some truths cannot be unlearned.